Good morning. Good morning. It's so good to see each and every one of you this morning. If you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and you can turn to John chapter 1. And so next week is the start of a new quarter. So next week is November the 2nd. We're going to be starting a new class. And that class is going to be on hermeneutics, or how to interpret the Bible. And so I think that'll be a different type of class for us. But it's a class. We've been giving out surveys for a few years asking what type of adult classes that you would like. And each time that one has ranked pretty high, a class on either hermeneutics or interpretation or hermeneutical principles. And so we're going to be starting that class next week with the start of the new quarter. And I'm excited about that, which means this week we're kind of closing a little study we've been doing on the apostles. Anybody ever watched Gilligan's Island? Ever watched that? So that was still on TV when I was a kid. And so later on in the seasons, you would have everybody's name mentioned in the introduction song. But it was like the old original black and white first season. Like after like Gilligan, Skipper, it was like, and the rest, like they didn't get their own life, like, so we're doing today, right? So each one we've had like Peter, John, Andrew, and now it's like the apostles, the rest, right? So we're kind of like in our Gilligan theme era, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Well, we've talked about Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Philip, and now we're going to be talking about the rest of those. The first of which we're going to talk about is Bartholomew. We're going to kind of go in the order in which most of these are in the disciple listings that you see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also the book of Acts 1:13. And so one of the ones that we don't have a lot of information on is the one named Bartholomew. And Bartholomew is also named Nathaniel. And Nathaniel actually plays a pretty interesting part in John chapter 1, even though he doesn't really play a large part in any of the rest of the Gospels. So it's just kind of interesting. Also, Philip and Bartholomew, or Philip and Nathaniel, are mentioned side by side in every single disciple listing, which kind of makes sense because Philip is the one that actually goes to Nathaniel or Bartholomew and tells him about Jesus. In John chapter 1, you remember in John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51, where we're told that Philip goes out and he goes to Nathaniel and he says, hey, we have found the one the prophets talk about, this Jesus from Nazareth. And Nathaniel says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip says, come and see. Right? And so he comes and sees, and then he, is going there, and Jesus says, oh, an Israelite in whom there is no guile, right? This is a true Israelite, right? This is a good guy right here. He's like, how do you know me? Like, why do you say that? He said, before Philip called you under the fig tree, I saw you. And he falls down and he says, you are the King of Israel, you are the Son of God, right? And so John 1:49, and Jesus says, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree? Trust me, man, you're going to see a lot more than that over the next couple of years. And so you're going to see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, right? And so here we have the call of Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel. And so pretty interesting that so early in the Gospel of John, you have such a high praise. You're the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you don't get men saying those things until you have like Peter saying something like that, like in Matthew 16, like right before the crucifixion. And here you have it in John chapter 1. And so Nathaniel or Bartholomew. And so according to church tradition, Bartholomew is primarily connected to preaching the gospel in India or Armenia. So Armenia is going to be the kind of that very tip, which is on the other side of the Black Sea. And so right there. And then India could refer to pretty much modern day like Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, all the way to kind of like modern day Pakistan or the very western portions of India. And so after the disciples are sent out, the apostles are sent out, he is typically associated with this situation right here. And it's believed or at least tradition holds that he was flayed alive and beheaded while preaching in Armenia. And so that's Bartholomew. Right? And then we have Thomas. Now, Thomas means the twin, right? And so there were some twins back home where I'm from, and their names are Tim and Tom, right? Which is good because Thomas means twin. So that's good on Meemaw. She's not my Meemaw, she's Martha Atkins, but to me she was Meemaw growing up. And so, but the only really mention in John's gospel, which is kind of interesting because Thomas actually features 3 separate times. So once we get out of that kind of inner circle, we're going to look at like Bartholomew and Thaddeus and, Judas, who's not Iscariot, and all these guys. And there's like not really much mentioned. But Thomas is interesting because Thomas is actually mentioned 3 separate times in the Gospel of John. And all these I think are pretty interesting. The first of which is in John chapter 11, verse 16. Now, Thomas means the twin, so we don't know if he had a brother or not or what that was, but Thomas means twin. And so, but the first one that we see him mentioned is in John 11:16. And I think Thomas is kind of your sleeper. He's kind of the sleeper, underappreciated apostle, I think. And so, but in John chapter 11, Lazarus has died. The Bible tells us in John chapter 10 that the scribes and the chief priests had committed themselves to killing Jesus. Like they've talked about it, they've debated about it, but now they're going to kill Jesus. And Jesus has to leave Judea. Okay, it's too hot. And so he leaves and he gets word that his friend Lazarus has died. Okay. And so the disciples are trying to convince Jesus that we don't need to go back to Judea. If he's sick, he'll get better. He'll be fine. Right? And so Jesus, he's sleeping. They're like, oh, great. If he's sleeping, that's how the body heals itself. He'll be fine. Jesus says, he's not sleeping. I mean, he's dead. And the disciples are like, well, if he's dead, he's dead. Right? There's no sense in going back. And Jesus says, no, we're going to go back. We're going to go back. And we're going to go back so you can see the power of God. And the disciples are like, no, we're not going back. They tried to kill you the last time we were there. We're not going. And Thomas, he's the first one that speaks up, and he says, let us go that we may die with him also. They're so afraid that if they go back, they're going to kill Jesus. And Thomas says, let's just go and die with him. Right? And so you see this I think, one of the most courageous statements, I think, in the Gospels occurs by Thomas. Nobody remembers that because everybody remembers chapter 20. And but in chapter 14, he also is mentioned in chapter 14, whenever Jesus is talking about showing the Father, he says in John 14, verse, so it should be 5. It says John 14, 15. If you're taking notes, that's a typo. It should be John 14, 5, where Jesus says, I'm going to the Father. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And he says, well, Lord, show us the Father. That's enough for us. And he says, Thomas, I've been with you so long that you don't know that anybody who's seen me has seen the Father, right? And so that's in chapter 14, verse 15. And then the last one, which he's most known for, is his doubt, right? In John 20, 24 through 29, after Jesus is resurrected from the grave, he is there. And Jesus shows himself in the upper room, the same upper room where they had the Lord's Supper a few nights earlier. Jesus passes through the walls of the locked door. He stands in their midst and he shows everybody his hands and his side. But there's a problem. Thomas isn't there. So Thomas has went out to something, get food, or he's been called away or whatever it is. So he gets back and the disciples are just super pumped. Like, Thomas, we saw Jesus. We saw him. He says, I just can't believe that. They're like, no, man, he was here. And he had holes in his hands. And Thomas says, unless I put my finger in the hole in his hands and I put my hand in his side, I'll never believe. Right then, of course, the next week, Jesus comes back and appears himself in the midst. And Thomas is there. And Jesus just goes up to Thomas and he says, here, Thomas, put your finger in my hand. Put your hand in my side. Right? And then Thomas falls to the ground and he says, my Lord and my God. Right? John 20, 28, one of the greatest statements, right? So really, two of the greatest statements that we have in all the Bible, but especially the Gospels. Let us go and die with him and my Lord and my God, both from the lips of Thomas. And so I think Thomas gets a bad rap. But anyways, so Thomas is primarily connected with Parthia. So Parthia is kind of like ancient Persia, right? And so he's connected with Parthia, which is Persia, and also India, which can kind of be like that kind of Afghanistan, Pakistan, very Western, what we might have modern day India, right? And so most of you know that Pakistan was a part of India until 1949, right? So for the longest time, that was pretty much West India, okay? And so it only became Pakistan because the Western part of India converted to Islam, and they wanted their own country and started a civil war, so. And so, but we think of India, that's kind of, the ancient world would have considered like that kind of, that place would have been India. And so he's traditionally believed to have been martyred in India, possibly by spearing around 72 AD. Which leads us to our next disciple, which is Matthew. And Matthew is also called Levi, the son of Alphaeus. He is present, like all the others, in the disciple and apostle listings in Mark 10, Matthew 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. Jesus calls Matthew and eats with him. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, Jesus is at the tax collecting booth, and we've all heard that sermon before, where the tax collectors were one of the most despised members of Israelite society. They were collecting money from their brethren to give to the Romans. I mean, they were just considered to be the greatest, lowest of the low, right? They were just, you've betrayed your country, really. And so Jesus goes up to Levi, Matthew, and he says, follow me. And Matthew gets up and he leaves this lucrative job. Being a tax collector was a pretty good job for the money. That's why you would do it. And so he leaves this lucrative position as a tax collector. And we know he's a very wealthy individual because of what it said later. It says that Matthew follows Jesus, leaving this lucrative job behind. And then he goes home and he throws a great feast. If you read the book of Luke, it says it was a great feast with a large company. And so not just a little feast, he throws a great feast with a large company, right? So much so that it draws the attention of the scribes and Pharisees, and they say, look, this man eats with sinners. And Jesus says, the well have no need for a physician, right? The doctor comes to heal the sick, right? So that's kind of the only real story we have of Matthew's life. There's really nothing else said about him in the rest of the gospel accounts, just that one time where Jesus basically says, follow me. He leaves. He throws the massive banquet, which draws the condemnation of the Pharisees. And then Jesus says what he's doing. He's also mentioned as the son of Alphaeus, which is interesting because there's another disciple who's mentioned. His name is James, the son of Alphaeus. And so what we do know he's a wealthy tax collector who gives up his wealth and his security to follow Jesus. We also know that he writes a gospel, okay, the Gospel of Matthew, which I believe was written probably in the 40s or 50s. For the longest time, people believe Matthew was one of the first gospels written. And then in the 1800s, we decided that he was not the first gospel written because I really don't even know why. But I still think that Matthew's probably one of the earliest gospels written while he is laboring in the Palestine area, writing a Jewish gospel to Jews, is what I think. And so that's what we know. And he probably most likely is the brother of James, the son of Alphaeus. There are three places where Matthew is really connected after the Gospels come to a close, and that is in Judea, which I think is the most likely. Other areas where he's mentioned as being is Ethiopia and Persia. I think those are probably unlikely, but I think that, could he have gone there? Yeah, he could have gone there. But we definitely know that he was in Judea, laboring there, and that's where he writes his gospel. Right, which leads us to the next one, who's probably his brother, James, the son of Alphaeus. So in every single disciple listing, you've got James and you've got Matthew either side by side or with one person in between. And that one person in between, I think, is Thomas. I could be wrong, but they're real close to each other in the listings. And so he's not James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John. He's not James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus. He is James the Less or James the Younger, Mark chapter 15 and verse 40. The only thing that we know about him is that he was a disciple. There's never a story about him, never anything having been recorded from his lips. We just know that he was a disciple. Kind of interesting to think that Jesus had dozens of disciples that were with him every day for years. And even among those dozens of disciples, you had like this inner core of 12. And we only know anything about 5 of them, right? I mean, it's just kind of interesting that you have the other 6 or 7. We just have basically a name, and that's it. But unfortunately, that's all we have of James, the son of Alphaeus. He preached in regions such as Persia, Egypt, or Palestine. And so here we go. We've got a similar map to Matthew. Matthew was a little bit southern in Africa and Ethiopia, but supposedly Egypt, Persia, or Judea. All right? And special treat, I brought the next disciple here this morning. His name's Thaddeus. Over there. And so Thaddeus is the only Thaddeus I know. And so it's a cool name, though. It's a great name. Thaddeus means heart or courage in Aramaic. Okay, so appreciate Thaddeus. They live in West Tennessee, married Macy Lemons, obviously. They can't come back every week, but he'd come back for this class. So please tell Thaddeus thank you to be a live illustration for us this morning. And so, anyway, so his other name was Judas. And so a very common name in the first century was the name Jude or Judah or Judas. So if you see Jude, Judas, or Judah in the Bible, it's the exact same in Hebrew and Greek. There's no difference. There's a difference in the English, the way you write it. In Greek, there's no difference. Jude, Judah, Judas, exact same, right? Brittany was like, if we're going to have a boy, we could do Judah. I was like, it's the same name as Judas, though. She's like, really? I was like, yeah. She's like, nobody's going to know that. It's like, I'm going to know that, though. Like, I'm going to know it. And so, but yes, Charles, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Names like Nathaniel, to me, that's kind of a complicated, pretty name. But did they really walk up and say, hey, Nathaniel, or did they have another, say it a different way?
Well, a lot of that is, it could be anything. I mean, some of that is cultural. Like, I remember back in the day where everybody went by, I'm sorry, I don't remember that. I know of back in the day where everybody went by initials. Like in the late 1800s to early 1950s, like everybody was their first and second initial. It was BC Goodpasture, GC Brewer, right? NB Hardiman. Like everybody was their first two initials. So some of that is cultural. So could they have gone, his name could have been Nathaniel and he went by Bartholomew.
Would they say the word Nathaniel? That was actually real.
Yeah.
Not a translation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the real word, right? Is Nathaniel. Yeah. Now, whether he went by Nate, or something like that, I mean, people have nicknames throughout all history. So we just don't know enough to know, right? It's a good question. So, yeah. But I think people have always gone by shorter names or nicknames. So I wouldn't be uncommon, which is why I think a lot of these have two. You've got Nathaniel and Bartholomew, right? This one, you've got Thaddeus, and you also have Judas, right? And so he's got both, right? So one could be a nickname. One could be his name could be Judas, right? That's not really a nickname. Okay, that's more of a name, right? Jude, that's a name. Thaddeus, right? Courage, heart, that's more of a nickname, right? That could be there, which is probably why there's both listed, right? Because he's Thaddeus, I believe, in Matthew and Mark. Let's look at my notes. He's Thaddeus in Matthew and Mark, and he's Judas, the son of James, in Luke and Acts, right?
Did you get these names later in life? How do you know what a child's going to be?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point, right? Well, it's kind of like, like you were saying, do the nickname come before or after? I'd say probably after. But some people would pick nicknames for their kids when they're infants, right? So it's just kind of hard. It depends on the family and the person. So one of those things we like to know, but probably will never know. And so, but Thaddeus, also Judas, not Iscariot, is what he's mentioned in Luke 6 and Acts 1. And we do have something. He says one thing in the Bible. He does say that. And so in the Last Supper, John 14:22, he refers to Judas, not Iscariot, who asked Jesus at the Lord's Supper, Lord, how will you manifest yourself to us and not to the world? And so this is the only reference we have of Thaddeus or Judas, not Iscariot, in the Bible. Okay? And so he is traditionally associated with these regions, Judea and Samaria, and also Syria, Mesopotamia, or Armenia, which is going to be like kind of modern day Syria, Iraq, Eastern Turkey, and the present day country of Armenia. He's traditionally believed to have been martyred, possibly by being clubbed to death with an axe in Persia or Armenia. So,
Did you ever say anything about Matthew?
Yes, we weren't there very long. We did say something about Matthew.
Which one was the update for that? Did you say which one was? You got Matthew or James?
Yeah. I was saying, yeah. Yeah, Matthew and James, the son of Alphaeus, I think are brothers. The fact they're both called the son of Alphaeus, we do see a lot of brother dynamics in the disciple list. You've got Peter and Andrew, James and John, right? So if these two are brothers, I mean, I think it would be kind of hard pressed to name both of them the son of Alphaeus. How were they martyred? Yeah. Matthew, I have to go back. Matthew is said to have been possibly beheaded or burning. I don't know if I said that actually. That's why you're probably asking that question. And so, but some accounts say that he was beheaded, and some say that he was killed by burning. And then James, some traditions claim that he was martyred by either stoning or crucifixion in Jerusalem. And that's James, the son of Alphaeus. And so, good. All right, good. Yeah, I looked over those. Thank you, Ken, for asking about that. And so, good. All right. All right, Simon the Zealot or the Cananean. Okay. All right, so Simon the Zealot is what he is called in Luke and Acts, and he's called Simon the Cananean in Matthew and Mark. These refer to the same person. One important note, I heard one time somebody say that Simon was a Canaanite. That's not what that word means. And so that word is derived from an Aramaic word, kanana, which means zealot or zealous one, and does not indicate a geographic origin, right? And so I understand that it looks like Canaanite, right? But it's not the same thing. They're two different words that mean two separate things. And so he's not a Canaanite. He's an Israelite, right? But he is zealous. So basically you have the same thing. You just have one person using a Greek word, Luke using a Greek word, Luke and Acts, which makes sense because Luke is a Gentile, right? His first language is Greek. And then you have Matthew and Mark, who are both, they're both Israelites, both from Judea, or at least that region, and they use the term, the Aramaic word, right? And so there you go. And so zealot could refer to the anti-Roman political group. So oftentimes you'll hear stories about Simon being a zealot. The zealots were this kind of like, this paramilitary group that were super anti-Romans, and they carried swords. And like if they saw a Roman soldier by himself, they'd take the sword, they'd kill him in the streets. And some of that's probably jazzed up a little bit. And so we don't know. Zealot could mean that. The zealots actually are more popular later. And so Jesus' ministry starts in the mid to late 20s. And so the term zealot to refer to a group of people who were like banding together and meeting privately and trying to kill Romans in the streets and start the Civil War, that's like 25 to 30 years later in the 50s and the 60s. It preaches good. It makes a good illustration. I don't know if it really fits, if that makes sense. And so it could mean to that. I think it probably just means he had a zealous personality. I think it's the same thing as Thaddeus, right? Thaddeus means heart or courage. Zealot's just someone is zealous. He's a go-getter, this type of thing. Now, that's my opinion, and there are lots of people with other opinions, but that's just mine. And so we don't know hardly anything about Simon. Really interesting, though, is that the tradition suggests Simon preached in regions such as Egypt, North Africa, Persia, alongside Thaddeus, potentially. But the oldest, now when we say tradition, or some of these traditions come from like the 300s, some of these traditions come from the 1200s, okay? And, the ones in the 1200s, that's just not true. But the really cool thing about Simon is that Simon has some of the earliest traditions that we find about where he went, and the place he went will blow your mind. And so the earliest things that we have from Simon actually come from 200 AD. Hippolytus of Rome, in his book, The 12 Apostles, mentions Simon's crucifixion in Britain, or the islands of Brittany, during the Roman conquest. Another reference to Simon the Zealot in Britain also appears in Dorothius of Tyre, which is a 3rd century church leader, and his writing is dated to about 255. And so we have one writing from 200 and one writing from 255 that actually place Simon in England, right? The other one is in Carthage, which is in North Africa, modern day Tunisia. And so, but that's pretty interesting to think about, an apostle going all the way to England, right? I mean, so, that's pretty cool. If you put the United States on there, Carthage, or even if you look at that, I mean, like Judea, and you can just on your own online, and you can see, like, it looks like it's a really long ways away, but like, if you put Florida where, Judea is, I mean, Great Britain is what? Missouri? I mean, seriously, like, I'm not even being cute right now. Like, isn't that about right?
It's farther than that.
Is it?
Looks it to me.
It looks like it. But if you never put the map of America, I mean, Germany, okay, you see Germany up there? You see that right there? Okay, Germany's the size of Georgia. That's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, you look at Europe and you think, oh, wow, that's massive. If I say Germany's the size of Georgia, all of a sudden now you're like, wait a minute. That don't seem that far. I'd drive through Georgia, get to Florida. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. And so, but anyways, I'm just saying it's conceivable, right, for him to have made it to England. People are like, that's just too far. Well, I mean, is it really though? I mean, I don't know. And so, I can't believe somebody's not Googled at this moment how far away Judea is from London. Oh, Devon. And so, anyways, so Judas Iscariot, he's not an apostle. This is an apostle class, but I thought he was with the Lord for 3.5 years, so give him a little credit. And so Iscariot likely derives from a phrase meaning Ishkarioth, meaning man from Kerioth, town possibly in Judea. It might be the same town mentioned in Joshua 15:25. If so, this would make Judas possibly the only Judean among the apostles. The rest of them were mostly Gentiles or Galilean, Gentiles. That's totally wrong. Most of them were mostly Galileans, at least that we know of. He was a devil, and so Jesus calls him a devil in John 6:70 and 71, who portrayed Jesus for money because he was a thief, John 12:4-6 and John 13:29. He led the soldiers to Jesus in the garden and identified him with a kiss. And Jesus tells Pilate that his punishment is going to be great because he betrayed the Son of Man. He feels bad about what he's done afterwards. He hangs himself. No one cares enough about Judas to get him off the rope. And so he lays there while his body petrifies and swells and eventually falls down and bursts open. And the Bible tells us that the leaders took the 30 pieces of silver. They bought a field to be kind of a potter's field, a place to bury poor people that don't have any money. And so that's where he's buried. So that's Judas Iscariot. Then we have Matthias. Matthias is an interesting one, right? Because we're talking about the apostles, and Matthias is an apostle. So after Judas's death in Acts chapter 1, they're there in Acts chapter 1, they're talking, and so we need to have 12 apostles to initiate the kingdom because of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we see that in Acts chapter 1, verses 20-26. And so they get together and they say, okay, we need to have a new apostle, but there's some criteria, right? The criteria is he has to be someone that was with Jesus from the days of John's baptism all the way through Jesus' ascension. That's minimum 3 years, max 4 years. And so the criteria, I think, is actually pretty extensive. I mean, this has to be somebody who was with Jesus day in and day out for the last 4 years. We know there wasn't just 12. When I was a kid, I just had a picture of Jesus just walking around with 12 guys. Sometimes that was the case, but not often. And so at one time, Jesus in Luke 10 sends out 72 disciples, right, and gives them the power to heal and cast out demons and all kinds of stuff. So Jesus has a lot more. Acts chapter 1, there's 120 disciples. So Jesus has been killed. Everybody's gone off and they're afraid. And even the people who have deserted Jesus, but there's still 120 disciples that are left, right? And so there's a bigger nucleus is what I'm trying to say than just 12 individuals. And they're the inner circle, right? They're obviously the inner circle of the privilege, but there's others. But there's only 2 that meet this requirement. I mean, the days from Jesus' baptism by John the Baptizer, so even before Jesus' public ministry, all the way to his ascension, okay? And so 2 guys, there is Matthias and there's Joseph, I believe. And so they say, Lord, you know the hearts of all men, choose the right one, and they cast lots, and it falls on Matthias. And that's the last we hear of Matthias, the rest of the Bible. So we only mentioned we know that he's with Jesus for 3 to 4 years, and that he's chosen to replace him as an apostle. And so church tradition holds that Matthias preached in the regions of Judea, Cappadocia, or Ethiopia. And you can kind of see those circlings right there. Cappadocia would have actually been really close to Tarsus, where Saul was from. And so if that is the case, it would be kind of interesting. We do know that Saul goes back to Tarsus for a little while after his conversion. There's no way of knowing this is true or not, but it's kind of interesting to think that while Paul is a young Christian, there may have been an apostle, Matthias, who was actually preaching or teaching near where he was at. So don't know for sure, but just kind of interesting. And so, yeah, Jim.
I just need you to clarify something for me.
Well, I don't, no promises.
Looking at Judas Iscariot, I thought that he was called by Jesus to be an apostle. And in my thinking that he was until he decided to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, well, he was definitely a disciple, and he was in that inner 12, but he was an apostle. And it's a semantic, I was going to say game, but I don't think it's a game. But just because disciple and apostles are different things, right? But I'm glad you asked that question because it reminded me to cover that. And I'm not letting you out 10 minutes early. I mean, who does that? And so, no, I'm just playing. And but that's an important distinction because Judas is a disciple. He's not an apostle. Okay.
How come he was in the room with the whole group at the table?
Well, because he's in the 12. So he's one of the inner 12. So Judas is mentioned in the inner 12 in all the 12 listings in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so he's one of the 12. And so there's a larger group, right? But, inside that larger group of close followers, you do have the 12, the inner circle, right? Why is there 12? Peter tells us it's symbolic, the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't know how many people you can fit in an ancient fishing boat. It's probably about 12, So, I mean, there's a status thing, right? They're in the inner circle. They're closer. And so, but Judas is a disciple. He's not an apostle. Because what makes somebody an apostle as opposed to a disciple? Seeing the risen Lord, right?
But I remember Judas, wasn't he sitting next to Jesus at the Lord's Supper?
Yes, and so you have to go back and kind of recreate where everybody is sitting based upon what is said in John's gospel, right? And so we know that Jesus is at the head of the table. It appears that John is on his right-hand side, and that beside John is Peter. So the two places of highest honor, usually in kind of the Greco-Roman banquet, would have been the first one on the right and the first one on the left, typically. And so that's that's probably true with Jewish culture also, but it's more that's more of a Greek and Roman thing. But it probably has bled into. We don't know. I mean, because people be like, because here's where we're going with this. Okay, so John's on the right hand side, right, and Peter's beside John. Okay, so according to kind of the Greco-Roman rules, you'd have John's in the number 1 spot. Peter's in the number 3 spot, okay? Peter leans over and asks John to ask Jesus who it is that's going to betray him. And Jesus tells John, the person that I'm going to dip this morsel of food in and hand it to. Theoretically, if Jesus is reclining at a table, the only person he can hand something to is one on the right and one on the left, right? And so that's where people say that Judas was on the left of Jesus in the number 2 spot. And so,
Maybe in my mind, you just think that he's an apostle as opposed to a disciple.
Yeah. Well, he's not an apostle because he doesn't see the risen Lord, right? But he is a disciple. So kind of and even though he's included in Isaac's apostle class, but a little caveat there, right? Ken?
When were they announced?
When they announced apostles? Well, the word apostle is a title for us, but it's a word in Greek, apostolos, means sent. Okay? So Paul says there are 500 who saw Jesus at one time. And people say, well, if the requirement is to be able to see the risen Lord, 500 people saw him according to 1 Corinthians 15. So why aren't there 500 apostles? Because they weren't sent out on a mission, right? And so apostolos means someone who is sent, right? So even though there are hundreds of people who see the risen Lord, these are individuals who were chosen and sent for a specific purpose. That's why everybody gets confused as to why Silas is called an apostle, right? They get all confused because they're like, why is he called an apostle? Or Barnabas, why is he called an apostle? Because they're sent by the church in Antioch, right? They have been officially sent, right? They are representatives, right? And so whenever Barnabas is called an apostle, he's an apostle of the church in Antioch, not of Jesus in Acts chapter 1, right? Does that make sense? And so,
Why would the disciple be sitting in an honor place beside Jesus?
one more time, James.
Why would the disciple be in an important place beside Jesus rather than an apostle?
At the Last Supper, there are no apostles. Because the apostle is a term that comes into being after his resurrection. So they're all disciples in the upper room. After Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection, and commissioning, right, then they're apostles. But Judas isn't there because he's already died. Does that make sense? So. Well, I don't know the kids' song. I don't know what that is. That's fine. He called me, do we say Judas or do we say Matthias? I feel like that's kind of straight out of Nat right there, but you just get to that point, and then when I teach this class in 10 years, we'll just, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, he's a disciple, not an apostle, right? But he leaves a vacant spot because there needs to be 12, right? And then some would say, well, if there needs to be 12, why is Paul? Well, because Paul tells you why. Paul says, I'm not the apostle to the Jews, signifying the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is sending the 12 apostles to the 12 tribes of Israel. Peter is sent to the Gentiles. He says, I am the apostle sent to the Gentiles, right? That's why you have 13, right? And so, because some would say, well, why if there's 12, why is there 13? Which actually makes even more sense because how many tribes are there in Israel? It's actually 13, right? We say the 12 tribes of Israel because we don't count Levi, right? And so it's actually 13. So there's even better, you have the 12 tribes of Israel, and you have Paul gets brought in to the Gentiles, which makes 13, and there really is 13 tribes. So it's just perfect, right? It just all lays out perfectly. So good. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, good. Well, I'm looking forward to being with you next week. Like I said, we're going to do the class on hermeneutics. Brittany's due date is set for like week 8 of that class. And so we're going to see how that shakes out. And so we'll get us through as many weeks as we can. And so, but appreciate y'all. And let's go ahead and close in a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day that you've given to us. We're thankful for this time to come together to enjoy each other's fellowship, to enjoy a time of worship, and also to enjoy a time of study. And dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the faithful examples that we have set before us, the faithful examples of Enoch, and also the faithful examples of the apostles who devoted their lives to following you through great tribulation and harm and persecutions, and in many cases, cruel deaths. And yet they devoted themselves to you and to preaching your gospel. And dear Heavenly Father, please help us to realize how blessed we are to be the beneficiaries of their work, but also how blessed we are to be in a situation where we are called to do the same things that they were called to do, but under much different and oftentimes better circumstances. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to use them as models of us not to shirk back from difficulties, but to strive to do our best to be those who have been sent out to share the good news of Jesus with others. We're so thankful for your Son and the salvation that we have through him. It's in his name we pray. Amen.